I seem to have lived all my life on impressions, sort of fleeting impressions, which are intense and memorable often. My first memories were walking through woods in Thuringia, where there are wonderful woods, and trailing behind the grown-ups and thinking of fairy tales and retelling myself fairy tales, I think. We went for walks by the Rhine, and I remember a huge flood on the Rhine when there were huge blocks of ice floating down and people were jumping from one ice block to another. And my brother said, "Oh, I'll do that." And I remember my parents being very upset that he might actually do that, but he didn't. And I dreamt of being lifted up with one of these cranes, and I thought how wonderful it would be to be up there in between the river and the sky and suspended, and to look at the world from that point of view and possibly to travel around a bit. I really loved the landscape, the huge sky and the boats going down the river, the little allotments. I loved the allotments. Later on I realized that they were a sort of precursor of looking at pictures by Bonnard, strangely enough, done in a totally different light and climate. Always thought I wanted to become a painter. My father had wanted to become a painter also, but I was sure I would be in that working in that field dimly when I was taken to this studio of Sofa, and I there thought this was an ideal sort of existence, and we became friends. I drew wherever I sat. At school, I drew under the desk, and teachers began to tolerate this. And when we went for walks, I would draw people from the back, which I still do sometimes nowadays. And I always was interested in especially people and trees, bare trees I liked very much. And so I went to a little art school and animals in the zoo. I went to a little art school, Karp, it was called, in Düsseldorf, and I was really the youngest there. I was still at school, but on a free afternoon I would go to Karp. So one day I came back to my parents and said, you know, I'm going to be given a wonderful order for being good at sports tomorrow. And they said, "Oh, wonderful, yes." And I said, "Baldur von Schirach is distributing it." And they said, "This is impossible. You cannot do that." So this was the time when they told me that this was impossible, that I was Jewish and that they were against the Jews, and then I learned that. But it needed that kind of incident for me to realize, although I knew at home there was sort of atmosphere of all sorts of apprehension, and my mother wanted to go away. I knew that. You know, my parents had said, you must go to a school, to a boarding school, they said. You must go away. And you can't go on schooling here. And I thought, gosh, I'd read a book called Bibi und die große Reise by a Danish writer called Karin Michaelis. And there the little girl had gone all around the world, or Europe anyway. And one of the places she loved very much, and there were beautiful illustrations in the book by Selma Lagerlöf, by Karin Michaelis, a Dane. And there she had been to a German school in the Odenwald, and it was called the Odenwald Schule, and it was headed by Paul Geheb, who was called Paulus by the children. So I said Odenwald Schule immediately. Little did I know, of course, that the Odenwald Schule was no longer in existence under Paulus, but that he had to emigrate to Switzerland because he was married to a Jewish person, first of all, and his ideas were against the Nazis. A day at the school or a visit to Paulus in his rooms up in his room, I went up the stairs and saw all these photographs of a man with a beard. I hadn't met him yet, my first day at school, when one's supposed to be homesick, I suppose. But then I met him and he said, "My dear child, are you homesick?" And I said, "Well, perhaps a bit." And I saw behind him big fir trees, you know, it was top of the house, and the fir was enormously high, and in the window behind him, this old man with a beard said to me, "I'm always homesick, so don't feel you're alone." And we had a long talk, and after that talk, I felt at home there. I wanted, after all, to study in England, which was perhaps easier, I don't know. But I had to have two guarantees, two people to vouchsafe for my not falling onto the state, or that sort of thing. And one of them was my great friend and teacher, Philip Drummond Thompson, who took me to the British consulate in Geneva, and sort of guaranteed or introduced me, I don't know, I got one of my visas through him, and the other one was through my friend, my brother's great friend in Scotland, whose father was a judge or something. A cousin of mine who was then 20 or 22 from Essen, one of my Essen Cosman cousins, Otta. She studied languages and she was in England, and she was destined to meet me at Victoria, to meet my train. And she did, and I then spent a night in London in a boarding house, which she had booked for me. And that was we went to the theatre that night, that's right. And there were drunken people. I thought they were dead in the street, but I was told they were drunk. This was, do you know, this was in 1938, just before the war. First impressions. Yes, well, I've always looked at people a lot, but without much thought, one might say. So my impressions were that of a girl who's been to school and who's sort of let loose in a world which she doesn't understand politically, structurally, or anything. And I was involved with looking and liking fish and chips in a newspaper, and going to the moors on walks with friends of my brother and him. He, having studied in Scotland, got a whiff of the fact that the best art school, supposed to be, was the Slade School in London. So he kept on writing to me to Geneva to say, "You must go to the Slade. When you come to England," which he thought was fait accompli anyway, I should go to the Slade. I was inscribed, and then 4 weeks later, little more than 4 weeks later, the Slade was evacuated to, or amalgamated, with the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford, and we were housed rather crampedly so in the Ashmolean. It was so beautiful, for one thing. I mean, I loved looking at the buildings and colleges, and everything was new, but the Ashmolean, of course, was empty by the time we got there. There were cast figures because everything else had to be hidden from possible bombs, you see. It was a totally new milieu in which I found myself. On the one hand, it was the milieu I had dreamt of, that was a sort of really bare living quarters, a kind of primitive way of living, very limited materially, with hardly any furniture. And on the other hand, it was very stimulating in other ways, and all this in the middle of a war, very strange. That little boarding house of my mother's in Wheatley in outside Oxford, that was populated by refugee friends. One of them was an old lady. I remember she became 80, and I thought, how fantastic, she's so old. And she gave me a commission to draw her, and I did draw her. And it was absolutely like her. She wore her little hat. It was marvelous. She was quite a good subject, but not very beautiful. It was so like her. I've still got a reproduction somewhere of the drawing, but I don't know where. And she took it, and of course she did not like it. I wouldn't like someone to draw me at my age either, but she'd asked me to. She'd wanted it, and I couldn't make her a beautiful girl, which perhaps she never was. Anyway, she gave me, instead of paying me, which I'd rather hoped, she gave me a little mirror, a hand mirror, which I've still got. Then I began to venture out into trying to find a job to do with my drawing, you see. And so eventually that happened. But that was quite a while after. That was in 40, no, not that long after, really. 46, autumn of 46, I had my first job for the Radio Times. Drawing Constant Lambert at the Maida Vale Studios in London. One day I heard there was this Edinburgh Festival, and I thought, I can't possibly stay away. This was in 47, September 47. And I thought, what can I do? And I thought, well, I'll go to all sorts of magazines and papers I've been working for or with, whether they want some drawings of Edinburgh, musicians in Edinburgh, because I didn't want Bruno Walter to meet the Vienna Philharmonic for the first time after the war, playing Mahler's Song of the Earth without being there. I mean, it was just a sort of incredible longing I had to be there, to hear it. And because having admired it on records all during the latter part of the war in Oxford. So I asked whether there was any possibility of them giving me a sort of little note so that I could get a press ticket. I couldn't possibly have afforded to go into the opera or to a concert or anything. So he said, well, we can't do that, but you ask our music critic, perhaps he might help you. Then I saw Hans for the first time, and it had been a very hot summer, and he was very brown and had these wonderful eyes. And I kept on thinking, he's got a turban on his head. I thought he was a Sikh, you know, an Indian dancer. I had done a lot of dancers meanwhile. And then we went to a restaurant, and that was the first time we met. The main thing that struck me when I saw him was his face. And I thought, if only I could draw that man. You know, that was my one thought. And later on, of course, I could. I mean, I did. I went to endless concerts, of course, wonderful things, and also rather tedious, everything that was new when he eventually had joined the BBC and had all sorts of functions there, different ones. The last of his fields, their specific fields, was new music. So he went to endless new music concerts in Park Lane Group and in the Purcell Room and wherever, and abroad to music festivals, ISCM, International Society of New Music. And so I really met an enormous amount of musicians, and not unnaturally, I fell to drawing a lot of them. Just when I met Hans, I had secured something I'd longed for years. That was a little ruin of a little house. It wasn't really a house, it was a stable. It had been a donkey stable at the turn of the century, almost bang on the heath in Willow Road. And it was raining through the skylights, but it was absolute absolutely wonderful. I mean, it was the sort of thing I was used to from my student days in Oxford, when I had a very rainy studio too, and a very primitive one. At least this one had a little loo. The Oxford one had a loo in the garden, and so that was already progress. But it had only one cold tap where we lived in Hampstead, and it was really very, very basic but wonderful, really wonderful, because in those days Hampstead was truly something like a little village, and one could stand in the middle of a road and talk to friends, and no harm would become you. Home for me is Hampstead and the Heath, and at the same time always, always the Rhine and the meadows on the Rhine and the sky. And I must say that is right in the pit of one's stomach, if you like, or soul. Stomach and soul, funny, perhaps they're the same thing, aren't they? I think the older one gets, the more conscious one becomes of this duality of where is home. Is it England, and especially Hampstead, or is it, does it lie on the banks of the Rhine? Everything is so very tangible, so very close within one. Graphically, I think I feel very much more influenced by the continentals, the Dutch and Belgians and German artists, and Austrian, I suppose. All my life I've been interested in humans, the human face, in movements, and animals also, and above all things that move, including the sky, I mean clouds, trees. I like the mobility, partly because I like to catch things on the wing. And in that way, I don't think I've changed very much. What has ultimately, I'm afraid, changed me willy-nilly is when it's now about 10, 11, 12 years ago, I had a terrible thing happen to me and I became half blind. And so now I work, of course, differently. And in some curious way, I'm not glad it happened because it slows me up. It makes my reading practically impossible. But drawing, I think it has changed and possibly made me more aware of economy in drawing. The details get lost, and I think economy is actually what drawing is about. You know, an abstraction is necessary, is the essence of good drawing. So the more you abstract, and if there is something which in itself becomes a kind of abstraction which you see, because you can't see that clearly, then that has got its compensations. Not in daily life, but perhaps in one's work, or in my work. So what I like most is to draw directly and make a dry point on a plate of some kind, copper or whatever it is. And that leaves me free somehow. It was really nothing short of a miracle in my generation to be able to be allowed to go to art school, to be at a time when horrendous things happened all over Europe and the East, everywhere. To be allowed to pursue one's own passion, to work at drawing and painting and looking at people and befriending people, to study characters, to be able to read, all this was so wonderful. When all is said and done, Goethe said it very well. And far be it from thinking myself as wise. I am certainly not wise. But Goethe said, to a wise man, all ports are havens. And I think I agree with that. Even if one isn't wise, one may look at life in that way. And perhaps that's the best way to survive the vicissitudes, which undoubtedly every life has. And I think it's wonderful to be alive. Thank you.